Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Canan Batur. I'm the curator of live programs here at Nottingham Contemporary. It's a great pleasure to give you a word of welcome and to host today's talk between Grace Ndiritu and Rebecca Nestor. It's also a pleasure to be doing this within this temple that Grace designed with Setworks. If you had the chance to visit the galleries, and see our exhibition, Our Silver City, you'll notice a map accompanying the space, which I'm holding here. Grace came up with this concept called spiritual overlay, to think of a building as a kind of spiritual technology in order to question what it means to create an architecture that is embodied. From a similar thread, she created a space within a space, a museum within a museum, a journey within a journey amongst many journeys that you will find in our Silver City, to take the audience members through all the galleries, starting in the east to the south, from the west to the north, to offer an attempt towards transformation. Sorry. We start with time of change, we go to time to understand, time for inner knowledge, and we end the journey in time to transmit wisdom. We're gathered here today in this space dedicated to inner knowledge and healing, inspired by traditional architecture as well as indigenous knowledge, through Grace's childhood memories of visiting her grandmother, and also the research she conducted in African adobe houses and sweat lodges. Some of the various skills and knowledges Grace looked into during the process of developing and materializing this segment of the exhibition. As I mentioned in today's talk, we will explore Grace's artistic practice further, thrown in conversation with climate psychologist Rebecca Nestor. Grace will also discuss the practice of healing in her work, as well as her experiences of living in alternative and indigenous communities as a way of thinking through issues of climate trauma and ecological activism. What we have decided to do tonight in terms of format is to start with a meditation led by Grace, that will only last for a few minutes, and then start the conversation afterwards. Halfway through, Rebecca will lead us through an exercise, and the Q&A will begin around 8 p.m. We will try to create an atmosphere of meditation, but also discussion, so you're welcome to ask your questions then. Now I'm going to read a bit about Grace's and Rebecca's bios. Grace Ndiritu is a British-Kenyan artist whose artworks are concerned with the transformation of our contemporary world, including the impact of globalization and environmental justice. Through her films, photography, paintings, and social practice projects with refugees, migrants, and indigenous groups. Works include the ARC Center for Interdisciplinary Experimentation, COVERSLUT, Fashion, and Economic Project, and performance art series Healing the Museum have been shown around the world since 2012. Recent group shows include the British Art Show in 2021, currently in Wolverhampton, and Coventry Biennial in 2021. Recent solo exhibitions and solo performances include Blue Coat Gallery in Liverpool in 2019, Eastside Projects in Birmingham in 2018, CAG Vancouver in 2018, Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw in 2014, and Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2013. Her debut short film, Black Beauty, has been selected for prestigious film festivals, including 72nd Berlinale in the Forum Expanded section and FIDMarseille in 2021. Ndiritu has been featured in Time magazine, Art Monthly, Elephant magazine, Phaidon's The 21st Century Art Book. Her work is housed in museum collections such as the Contemporary Museum of Art in New York, British Council, and Modern Art Museum in Warsaw. Her writing has been published in her critical theory book, Dissent Without Modification, in 2021, the Whitechapel Gallery in the Documents of Contemporary Art Anthology series, Animal Shelter Journals, Semiotext, the MIT Press, Metropolis M, and the Oxford University Press. And Rebecca is an organizational consultant, facilitator, and coach with a particular focus on supporting people and organizations with the emotional impacts of the climate and ecological crisis. Her consultancy specializes in helping people process the feelings that are evoked by working on the climate crisis, whether as sustainability professionals within organizations, or as campaigning groups and NGOs, or simply as citizens. She is a board member of the Climate Psychology Alliance and has recently completed postgraduate research into leadership in climate change organizations. Before I give the floor to Grace and Rebecca, some very brief housekeeping notes. Our live programs of talks, performances, and screenings seek to create challenging environments where open-mindedness and respect for each other's approaches and perspectives can foster growth. So please be mindful to and respectful of each other's opinions and views. Our appreciation goes to University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University for graciously and generously supporting our events. I would also like to acknowledge the staff who are supporting us this evening, Helen, Jim, and Shannon, and Ruby. Lastly, as with all events here at Nottingham Contemporary, today's talk is free to attend, but all donations are greatly appreciated to help support future free programs. Without further ado, Grace and Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, that was a very big introduction, so now we're going to come back down to earth and we're going to do a little meditation just for a few minutes. So it's nice if everyone closes their eyes and they get comfortable in their seat. And you close your eyes, start to connect with the breath. As it goes in and it goes out. Focusing on the breath just below the nostrils and above the upper lip. Not changing the breath, letting the breath be natural. As we notice the breath going in and going out, we notice slightly it's warmer when it comes out, it's cooler when it goes in. Feeling into the silence, letting our thoughts fade away as we always go back to the breath. Focusing just a little bit more to the last few moments. We bring our energy into this room, into this space, into this temple. And as we sit here as one, as a group of people today, we should remember and think at the back of our minds, how are we related to each other? How have we come together? And why are we here? Why have we chosen to be here today? Let's come back into the room and open our eyes. So I hope everyone's feeling a bit more grounded. So the reason why I wanted to do this talk today is because this project began in 2019. I got a strange email in 2019 from Nottingham saying, hey, we'd like you to be part of this project about the future. And I was like, okay, what do you mean? And then I quickly discovered that this was going to be a new adventure. And one of the parts of this project was always, when we started to have in our workshops together as a team, what it meant, what the future meant to us, you know. And one of the themes was always about the climate, you know. And so the climate for me was always, I'm always fascinated with how that affects us, not just in our bodies and our technology, but also in the psychology of us as humans. And at that time, in 2019, I was already saying, oh, those people in 2094, you know, they'll have so much trauma, they'll be experiencing a lot of climate trauma. And some of the team were like, no, they'll be used to it by then. But I still always felt like, no, trauma will become more and more embedded in us as a species because we'll all be experiencing this climate phenomena. And so I always wanted to speak to someone who would have some knowledge about that, and that's how the team managed to find Rebecca, and how we began having our conversation and our relationship. So today we're going to have like a conversation. I'm going to ask Rebecca questions, Rebecca's going to ask me questions, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. So I thought it'd be nice first for you to kind of talk about your background. So maybe some things about where you're from and, yeah, what you think could be interesting.
Okay, thanks, Grace, and it's great to be here. I'm going to be a bit careful what I say about my family and my background, because my family are here at the back there. Hello, Mum, hello, Martin, hello, Jem. And it's lovely to have you here. But yes, so my family is partly of British Indian origin. So my mum was born in India during the war, came over to Yorkshire at the end of the war, and that family has its roots in colonialism, missionaries and kind of managers of the Indian Railway, and absolutely kind of part of the British in India and all the colonial implications of that. So that's part of my origins. My dad is from a Methodist family in Yorkshire, much more kind of white working class origins, and the kind of I suppose what you might say Methodism and the meaning of that in the history of this country and how it arose in during the Industrial Revolution and the kind of working class people coming together. So that's part of my heritage too. But I live in Oxford. I'm middle class as they come. I'm white middle class woman, going to be 60 this year. Led a fairly kind of predictable, if you like, middle class sort of professional life. But part of the kind of Indian origins and the working class origins were also then kind of amplified in early experience, because in the late 60s, when I was like 4 or 5, as a family we went to live in Iran for 3 years. And that was really kind of foundational experience, I think, for all of us, and certainly for me and my sister. And part of what we've kind of carried into our adult lives from that is a sense of how we are part of that post-colonial project as well as the colonial project. So the sense of what are the British doing in Iran? Well, it's about the oil. And whether or not you were part of that, and we weren't, we were part of the British Council and the educative project, it's still absolutely part of our heritage. So I'm kind of sitting here acknowledging that that's in me. My experience of that is part of me, as well as my good intentions and my work on climate, which is also part of me. And I'll just finish by saying that about 15 years ago, I came to a realization that climate change was a real thing, was not going away, was not going to be all right, and became a climate activist in a fairly kind of localized sort of way, focusing on what we could do locally, not particularly protests, but practical work. And through that, I came up against climate psychology and understanding gradually all the emotional impacts of climate change on people, especially guilt and shame and the kind of silencing and disabling effects of those feelings, but also, grief and fear and disconnect and sense perhaps of like, what's this got to do with me? It's a messy area, and we can talk some more about it, but that's how I got there.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you also about, maybe you could explain first of all, what is climate trauma? Because I don't think many people understand that term, and maybe you could explain how does it affect people, individuals, and also maybe groups of people.
Yeah, well, I can try. So trauma, the word, of course, comes from the Greek, and it means wound. So it means something that absolutely kind of breaches the skin, makes a hole in you. And it is something that you can't accommodate. If you think of the idea of a wound, this is something that has done the damage almost before you realise it's there. And this is the thing about trauma, I think, that it's this sense immediately of a kind of reaction to close up, to be frightened, to kind of hold yourself against what's going on and shut it down. And this is a completely, in a sense, a kind of appropriate reaction to something that is a serious attack on the integrity of the self. And then there's a kind of other side of thinking of this, which is, I'm talking about the integrity of the self and the way trauma is about that being breached. Well, you could say, I think, and many people do say, climate psychologists, that there is an original trauma for the human race, especially those of us in the global north and the wealthy countries, which is this idea that we are, this misleading idea that we are somehow separate from the natural world and from each other. And that myth that we've some of us have bought into and our societies have bought into leads us to deny our interdependence. And so that makes us lonely, and it makes us feel uncared for, and sometimes it makes us uncaring, because we're kind of buying into this idea that we're somehow on our own in the world, and that is meant to be kind of who we are. And so the idea then is to think of climate trauma as recognising that it's a collective experience, that part of understanding and working with trauma is to recognise that, in fact, you're not an individual, you are part of the collective. And the fact is, though, that we treat climate trauma as though it was just a kind of mental health problem for individuals. People, when they're suffering from climate trauma, people may feel overwhelmed, they may feel unable to face things, they may feel unable to think about anything else except the trauma. And that can apply, I think, to people in this part of the world where we haven't yet really experienced the full exposure to climate change, where we're having floods and it's horrible, but it's not yet the kind of catastrophes that are happening in other parts of the world. So the climate trauma that we feel here is real. It's not the same as the climate trauma that may be felt by someone in a country where houses are being swept away, or where the temperatures are unlivable. But the fact of the trauma is real for both kinds of groups of people. And so people feel here, they may feel anxiety, they may feel guilt, they may feel overwhelmed, and they feel they're alone with it, and it's somehow their fault. And this is terrible, really. It is both what's got us into this mess in the first place, this idea that we need to be alone with difficult things, and it makes it impossible to manage. And so part of how climate trauma people think about trauma is at any opportunity to bring people together, to work on it together, and that's the kind of basis for a lot of the work. There's a little story that I might just tell. I saw a cartoon the other day. Don't know whether people have seen this, and it's sort of funny and not funny, I think. It's an image of a load of trees cut down to there, right almost down to the ground. And there's a small koala holding on to one of the trunks, right down here. And the koala is kind of shaking a bit. And there are two people with clipboards standing over the koala saying, this koala is suffering from mental health problems. Its whole world has been destroyed.
Yeah.
That's not a mental health problem.
Yeah. Yes, it's a bit more.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And I think that's the kind of that's almost like the dissonance that we have.
Exactly.
You know?
People oscillate between anxiety and despair and then hope. You know, like they go from being totally optimistic, thinking we found a technological solution to everything, and then totally just wanting to fall apart. And, you know, especially kids, I think, like, for example, in the pandemic that we've just experienced, you know, that kids of not wanting to get up in the morning, you know, and because they're feeling too depressed that the world's ended, you know, like this heavy weight. Yeah. And then, so that people are like going like this seesawing with their emotions. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's a feature of trauma, isn't it? That you kind of, you're either really, really, really hopeful and also perhaps also really, really, really connected with other people and kind of clinging on. Or you're flipping the opposite of both of those. And this is really kind of exhausting because but that is what trauma does to us.
Exactly, because it's like you have to have enough resilience within yourself to be able to get through the trauma, like to kind of coach yourself to get through the trauma, but not deny it, because that's where climate deniers come into it, like in the sense of they're denying a reality, the fact that this thing is actually happening, you know, and then it's like they're trying to dissociate, which is a form of mental illness in a way. You're trying to dissociate from a real thing that's happening to protect yourself. But actually, you know, that's really unhealthy as well. Yeah. Well, but just as much as like the other gung-ho people who are so in it 24 hours a day trying to fix everything. And then that's also impossible because it's like then you're getting a burnout. And I guess, you know, in my past, I would say, how I kind of got into climate trauma.
Oh yeah, tell us about that,
Yeah, like, climate trauma, it sounds like how I got into it. No, I think it's because, you know, my family, I grew up in rural Kenya and also in working class Birmingham, so also the two contrasts. But I've travelled a lot to many different places, and I think I've also been lucky to be able to experience places where there's a lot of wild nature. So in Kenya with like wild animals, you know, and seeing that. But also I travelled with some Tuareg nomads in Mali. I went there and I filmed them and things. And then, you know, seeing how they lived and, you know, lived in those conditions very simply, very happily, you know. But also this was in the Sahara and seeing how, and it was before the war that's been going on in Mali. So just the year before that began, and to seeing how like already like the US government were already trying to intervene, even though there was nothing going on. There were like many soldiers undercover doing reconnaissance for like, you know, water sites and mining sites, you know. So this kind of, this idea of, you know, how we experience the environment and the connection, like seeing the earth as just one big resource, you know, whereas the Tuareg nomads, that's their home. And even though it looks like there's nothing there, you know, and you can drive for days, you know, in the desert and not see a tree or a mound, they know exactly where they are, you know. And then I've also spent some time in Alaska in the summer and the winter, and in the top of Alaska, so Barrow. And I went there to make a video because I'd learnt to do Mongolian throat singing. And I had this idea to make a video to go as close as possible to the North Pole and to kind of like sing a song, because throat singing works on electromagnetic energy. And the idea was to send a song around the world, so like to sing from up there and it would go all the way around. And so I stayed in this place in Barrow, which is like a small village well, there's about 5,000 people that live there, and you can't drive there, you have to like fly there, and then there's kind of people that work in the oil fields, but then there's really like a lot of climate scientists there because it's, it's in the Arctic Ocean and things, and you can see, you're seeing over to the North Pole. And that was fascinating being there, and like also seeing like polar bears still being there and like coming to town, and also, people still, Inuit people still catching whales and things. And this was in 2008 or something. And then, but seeing how people would talk about the climate and understanding, okay, yeah, we're starting to see changes, not just the scientists, I mean, Indigenous communities there, and them talking about how it's affecting like how many whales they can catch and things like that. But I guess the most shocking thing I've ever seen climate-wise, I lived in Texas for a year, in Galveston, and this is an island, it's like a tropical island, but it belongs to Texas. It's in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's 5 hours from New Orleans. And so being in this area where it's been affected by hurricanes all the time, Hurricane Katrina, like the island has been decimated, then rebuilt, and then affected, and then, going to New Orleans and still seeing, 10 years later, whatever, houses with crosses, inhabitable houses. And because, with the news cycle, you think, okay, they must have dealt with Hurricane Katrina by now. Like, it's been 2 years, 3 years, everyone must have their house back. But no, there's whole roads, there's whole streets where it will never go back to the way it is. And I think that's fascinating because, in terms of thinking about time, and deep time, then we just don't understand the consequences of what we're doing. We think, okay, 5 years, 10 years, we'll fix it, whatever. But those people's lives and their children and their children's children, it's completely changed the trajectory. Yeah. That hurricane has completely remapped them. Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting. So I wanted to ask you also, because I know you work with individuals, but you also work with organisations. So how do you work with, like, say, for example, someone comes to you and they feel like they have climate anxiety and they're feeling burnt out, How do you work with them compared to, leaders in organisations of people who are trying to change the world, let's say?
And that's really hard, I think, because that sort of work, in an organisation where they're maybe campaigning on climate or they're, trying to get social change around it or changing perceptions. Has anybody here seen the film Don't Look Up? Yeah. So, I mean, that film came out in December, and I thought, okay, so I've nearly finished my thesis, and it was like, okay, I don't know why I'm bothering. This is kind of a description of what it felt like, I think. It's like, I know what I'm doing, I understand it, I know how to get it across, and nobody's listening. And this is huge, I think, for people. So there's this sense of people in that kind of work are in touch with the sort of environmental damage you were talking about, because they may be studying it or they need to understand it in order to communicate it. They're also, of course, part of this massive polarization, so they feel attacked by other people all the time. And they feel the sense of hugeness about the work, that, we've got 12 years or 7 years or whatever the current window is. And so the urgency is really overwhelming. And those are aspects of the trauma, I think. And then, of course, there's something really kind of intellectually overwhelming about the climate crisis. I don't know if you find this, but the sense of it, like, how do we even get our heads around it? How can we even understand what humans have done? Really, it's 30 degrees in the Arctic.
I think with numbers it's difficult. Yeah. I think it depends how your brain works. If you're a very rational person, scientific person, then maybe the numbers mean something. you know, but I feel like visualization of the numbers helps. You know, when I was in Patagonia, just before the pandemic, I was doing a project where I got to work with climate scientists and anthropologists, and one of them showed this map of the world from 2 degrees to 8 degrees, and it was just like red, dark red, you know, and only Patagonia was kind of orange, you know, and that was like really, that image is burned into my head, literally, you know, like I'm like, oh my God, you know, once I saw that, you know, I really got it, you know, in terms of, but one question I always wonder for you, like as an individual, like how do you balance working, you know, because there's a difference working with a group like Extinction Rebellion, you know, which is like, you know, obviously everybody knows what they're like, they're very active, but versus working with, let's say, an organisation, let's say a more a local organisation or more governmental organisation. How do you balance that?
Well, I guess it's different. You know, you're working, so I do a bit of work with Extinction Rebellion in Oxford, and I convene a group where they come and people who've got jobs to do in Extinction Rebellion come and talk about the challenges and share thinking with each other. And that's helpful because very often people doing that kind of activism have no space for thinking. You know, it's even Extinction Rebellion where they're actually working quite hard to create a sort of supportive culture. The work gets people very kind of, you know, traumatized, focused on the next thing. So that's helpful, I think, for them. I think for people working in the kind of organisations I mentioned a minute ago, you know, campaigning, sort of NGOs and that kind of organisation, they are, I think, often feeling that it's really important to stay connected to the establishment. You know, they don't want to seem too kind of aggressive or
polarising
or extreme, yes, and that's really hard. I think for people working there to hold that sense of the need for that, because and it often leads people. There's other pressures too, but it often leads people to feel that they have to be very positive. You know, they have to be very. There are things we can do. Yes, it's bad, but we've all got to pull together, and then and we can fix this.
Yeah.
And so underneath there is a sense of actually we may not be going to fix this.
Yeah.
And what do I do with that feeling? Because it's not allowed somehow. And so my work might be much more about just allowing some of that to be said. You know, acknowledging the despair or the sense of weirdness. You know, I'm saying all this positive stuff in public, but behind the scenes,
I mean, I can relate to that in a way, because in my own background, actually, because I studied textile art first, I didn't study fine art, and then I went to do like a postgrad, like MFA kind of thing in Amsterdam, and I started teaching myself how to make videos.
You have just lived everywhere, haven't you?
And I started teaching myself like how to make videos. But then at the same time, I already had a very deep esoteric practice. As a child, I was doing spiritual activities, but then at 19, I'd been to India, you know, I had gurus, I was doing retreats and things. And I always felt like I had to choose between, let's say, well, especially in the art world then, it just wasn't open for anything spiritual. You know, when I'd say, you know, to my teachers or my friends, oh, I'm going to meditate, people wouldn't, you know, they'd just laugh. They wouldn't understand what I was talking about. Whereas now, there's been a huge shift, you know, everybody does yoga and, you know, we all just meditated right now, and everybody kind of understood what that was meaning. But then there was also another kind of polarising thing in myself, because I grew up in an activist household. You know, my mother and her friends, they set up this group in the 70s, 80s called Women in the Third World, and they would like have film screenings and do anti-apartheid marches and things, and you know, and so there was always this thing about, you know, a split between spirituality and activism,
right?
You know, and like the fact that like activists always looked at spiritual people like, oh, you're not doing anything, you know, you can't meditate the problems away. And then some spiritual people would look at activists and say, you're just too caught in the real world drama, you know, and so how to balance those two things, because I mean, I've always thought those two things go together very well, and it wasn't till 2012 actually when I made a decision to kind of quit and leave and go off and live in the nature and the countryside. But during that time when I was going to make that decision, in a 2-month period, I managed to meet the Dalai Lama. I met another spiritual teacher, but I also met Marianne Williamson. So the thing about Marianne Williamson, she had always been an activist in the 80s during the AIDS crisis and things, but she was most well known for being a spiritual teacher, and she'd been Oprah's spiritual teacher, and she's written best-selling books and stuff. But she's a real fierce activist, and so I happened to meet her at this conference, and I was in a phase of oh my God, shall I give up art because nobody understands what I'm going on about with this spiritual thing and blah, 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 blah. And then, you know, talking to her and hearing how in the political world, you know, in her own life, let's say, in the spiritual world, people were like, you shouldn't go into politics. And at that time, she was already wanting to run for senator and, you know, to real life politics, you know. And she ended up becoming one of the presidential candidates, nominees in the last election in 2020 for the US, you know. And so it was really fascinating seeing how this very deeply spiritual, esoteric person went right into the lion's den, you know. And she was the one who, I would say, in the mainstream world, was the one that was going around on CNN and all those talk shows talking about healing. You know, I mean, I was doing it in the art world, talking about healing the museum, but she went out there and that's where Biden got the healing thing from, and that's where Trump got the healing thing. They got it from her, actually. Right. You know, and I think that's quite fascinating to see how the world has evolved, you know, so much that people understand the two things. They're not contradictory anymore. You know, you don't have to choose. You know, but I wanted to ask you, when these organisations, you know, because we've been talking privately about culture and race and things, do you think these organisations are too white? You know, because that's one of the criticisms about Extinction Rebellion.
Absolutely too white, and they know that and they acknowledge it, and that's not enough. And so I think it's. You know, I don't know what the answer is to that, but I think it may well be this very, this perhaps quite narrow approach to thinking about kind of fixing the climate crisis. You know, I think XR did a brilliant job with opening up the idea that, you know, extinction is part of their vocabulary, but it's still very much kind of government needs to do these three simple things. So I think in a way it is quite binary, and that makes and split. And so, you know, in psychology, of course, we talk about splitting as a coping mechanism. You know, if we can't manage, we'll just look at one thing. We'll say we are one thing rather than the other thing. And so you're talking about integration, and I think that's wonderful. But I do also think that it's quite likely with climate trauma that there is going to be more splitting, more polarising, and that it's not an accident, this is happening now, you know. It's to do with the climate, and it's to do with racial injustice. And so those things come together. And I don't have an answer to the Extinction Rebellion question, but I'm really interested. Here we are, a white woman and a black woman sitting together in this space with all of the kind of complexities about our identities as well, and what's brought us here. But you know, can we try and think about it? Is it possible to talk about it? Or do we get kind of overwhelmed? Do I get overwhelmed by shame and just go, oh, whatever you say, and I better not say anything?
Yes. No, for me, it's really important to talk about. But I think the most important thing that's also missing is to talk about Indigenous, you know, cultures and Indigenous knowledge, and you know how you know, because it's easy in, you know, the global north and the global south. We know that, you know, in the global south, the people are much more vulnerable to climate change because of, you know, the consuming of the global north. But everywhere in terms of indigenous populations, you know, the question of their relationship with nature and relationships with nations is really complicated. For example, okay, so in the Green New Deal, you know, in America, there's the Green New Deal, and this is about solar farms and blah, 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 blah. You have an issue of the fact that most of these things are being put in on indigenous lands, so like on Native American reservations, and there isn't necessarily a visibility and transparency being done in those deals. There isn't necessarily, because, you know, I went to visit the Hopi, okay, in Arizona, and there's a lot of places where people don't even have electricity or running water, and, you know, and that's America, okay? And then you're going to have all these solar farms, which is going to obviously help the people in LA or New York, or, you know, and so it's really complicated. And then, you know, it's also complicated by the fact you have, you know, Kyle White, who's an amazing professor, a Native American professor. He talks about the fact that there's this kind of, we've come to the point where there's this kind of two choices, because a lot of Indigenous people think we've gone past the point of no return, okay? And obviously they've been experiencing extinctions forever, you know, in the sense of ever since they've been in connection with Western people, you know, there've been genocides and land dispossession and, you know, exterminations and, you know, changes in their cultures. But especially at this point, you know, in order to not have the 2 degrees rise in temperature, you're going to have a lot of these solar farms. You're going to have all this infrastructure. You know, we have to have a lot of technological innovation, but most of that is done, like I said, without having these conversations. And then, so you've got that, but then you've also got the history of distrust, you know, and the fact that, you know, so many times you know, their connection to land, like in terms of like the feeling of kinship and reciprocity and stuff, is kind of still suppressed. So, you know, the point of environmental justice, it's not just about the land or nature, you know, it's also about people and animals and different species, and we're just one species, aren't we, on the planet? And so in most Indigenous cultures, there's that recognition of that kind of, you know, balanced relationship. But in order to stop the 2 degrees, you know, you're going to have to kind of, like, either you spend many decades rebuilding trust with Indigenous people and then learning about their traditional techniques. So, for example, you know, all those forest fires in California, you know, they're happening because all the traditional burnings that used to go on got stopped, you know, because of law changes and, you know, in the last 100 years, where Native people couldn't just, you know, naturally burn forests. And now you have these huge out of control burnings. Yeah. And so either, he talked about this idea of like, either you're going to have to spend decades rebuilding this trust so that you have some sort of, you know, equal power and empower these Indigenous communities and things, or you're spending time and you're finding this fixed short-term solution of technology. But to do that, then you have to kind of override this Indigenous way of thinking about the long term and 7 generations. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, and it's really difficult, isn't it? Because I know I keep saying this, it's really difficult, it's really hard. It is really hard. And I think that's absolutely right. There is this question, is it too late for any kind of climate justice for Indigenous peoples? Because there is, as you say, it's either you override needs and cultures and perceptions in order to prevent the 2-degree rise, or you spend ages doing it, and meanwhile the temperatures are going up. And so I don't know. Again, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do think so. This is very complex, I think, because I do think it's so important for the world to be able to learn from those principles of reciprocity and gratitude and taking what you need and no more.
Exactly.
But I also worry that some of the way that gets talked about in the global north is a kind of a bit colonialist in a way. It's sort of oh, we committed genocide on those groups, and they really learned a lot of stuff we could learn from them. So let's do a bit more kind of taking what we need from those groups. And I don't know how you do. I mean, you have got massive experience working with groups of Indigenous peoples and working alongside them and being supportive rather than kind of taking and taking. And
because
that must be a dilemma, I guess, in your work. But I'm interested to hear a bit more about that.
Not really. I haven't found it, because it's not like I work for a pharmaceutical company and I'm going and I'm learning all the secrets of the Amazon and then I'm going to make millions of it, is it? No, it's much more about having an equal conversation. For example, when I was working in Vancouver with some First Nation groups, we were actually, they'd built like, they call it a watch house over the pipeline. So they're building a pipeline and this is a protest place. And so we did a pipe ceremony there. But what was really interesting, the idea was that everyone from different tribes, but also from different parts of Canada and, whatever, would talk about their point of view. I was telling them about my point of view, but not just from Africa or Europe, but also about, because of the tribes that I've met in Argentina. And I think what's really interesting is that some people think they're alone, still, and that, there is the internet, but there's this idea that you have this huge struggle. When you're like fighting, multinational corporation, you can feel really like you're in your own struggle. And then I feel like it's kind of my job to say, oh no, I just met those people, in Patagonia, and they're fighting the exact same struggle. And, so you have this feeling of like solidarity, and it's an informal solidarity. It's not like when you go, when you go to UNESCO and it's like the UN Conference for Indigenous People. It's much more just informal, but that informal thing matters. It's much more powerful. It's like grassroots, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you swap information. For example, what's been interesting, because I've been working around restitution of objects in another project. So not just back to Africa, it can be to any source community, and how, like all, let's say, non-Western countries have this issue of wanting to get their objects back. So when you go and you're in a museum in Vancouver or in Argentina or in Belgium or in England, the British Museum, you can have the same conversations, because most museums, are still quite closed and narrow, about not wanting to give their objects back. So it's like it's a global issue, just like the climate, So, talking of the climate, we want to do an exercise with you. It's an exercise that Rebecca does in these things called climate cafes. Maybe explain first what a climate cafe is and about the exercise.
Yeah. So a climate cafe is a space where people come together to share their thoughts and feelings about the climate crisis. It's really, that's it. It's really simple. We call it a cafe because part of the experience is to share food and drink together, and it might take place in an actual cafe. And but one of the ideas is that it's a space that may feel a little different from an ordinary cafe, because we're trying to create a bit of safety around the idea of sharing what might be very difficult feelings. And I'll maybe say a bit more about climate cafes after we've done the activity, but I hope that's enough to be going on with. And I want to ask you to take part in an activity that we do at the very beginning of each cafe, which is part of this this intention to create a little bit of grounding. So Grace and I have both got two baskets each of. I'm not going to leave my microphone behind when I stand up.
Good idea.
What we've each got is 2 baskets of natural objects. They're mostly stones and shells, because she wouldn't let me bring the other stuff, because it would have made a mess.
No.
I did have pine cones and things, but no. So the idea is that you take the basket, if you would, and take one object from it and pass the basket round. Just sit with the object in your hand, feeling its cool or its warmth, feeling it settling into your hand, looking at it, maybe wondering where it came from, what it is, looking at the colours, the shape. What does it remind you of? What connections can you feel with it? I hope we have enough.
Does everyone have one?
If anyone doesn't have one, yes, please pass the baskets round until they're completely empty. Okay. So sit with your object, hold it in your hand, because the feeling is important. Get to know it, say hello to it. As I say, remember what it reminds you of, what memories come up, what feelings are you aware of. And then turn around so that you are facing 2 or 3 other people. There's no need to get up and move, but just wriggle round a little bit so that you're in a small group. No more than 4 would be good. So when you're settled, I understand it's not necessarily easy to find the right place, but when you're settled with a group of 2 or 3 other people, just then take it in turns to speak to each other. We're not going to ask you to share any of this in public, so it's a confidential group. And each of you take a minute or so to say something about your response to this item, this object in your hand. You may like to say something about what it reminds you of. Perhaps it reminds you of going to the beach as a child. I've been in climate cafes where people have said, this fossil gives me a bit of hope because it reminds me of deep time and the huge changes that have taken place in the universe over that period. But it also makes me grieve because it reminds me of death, and this object, this creature died so that I could hold it in my hand. So there could be all sorts of different feelings. It might be completely playful and perhaps a little superficial, and that's completely fine. Anything that comes up for you. And we'll just take 5 or 6 minutes maybe for you each to speak to each other about this. And there'll be no feeding back afterwards. I'll just say briefly then that in a climate cafe, which would normally be a much smaller group, the number of people who could fit round a table, we would go from that kind of introductions using the object to a discussion about, or to a sharing of, what are the feelings that I'm bringing to this space. And the idea of the use of a natural object is, and especially holding it in your hand, is that it has a kind of grounding and holding effect. Now, it may not always, and it may not have necessarily been like that for you today, but the idea is that there is the fact of holding on to something from the non-human world is comforting in a strange way. It also brings up emotions, and for people who are not used to talking about their feelings, that can be helpful. So that's the idea. And I'll sit down now, and I can see I'm louder than I meant to be. I'll sit down, and we can say a bit more about climate cafes if you like, or we can.
Yeah, one of the questions I had for you is, maybe you can explain a bit more about climate cafes, but also the importance of group process, like why you're interested in group process and this kind of rites of passage, and how that comes into your work.
And this is a big area for me, so shut me up if I'm going on too long about it. But so I'm really, really interested in this. I think that just at a very straightforward level first, about 3-4 years ago, there was a big awakening to what's happening about the climate crisis in the parts of the country that I'm in touch with. So lots and lots, suddenly, of conversations about we've had this drought this summer, the trees in the park are dying, how can that even be possible? And perhaps that's about climate change rather than just it's a hot summer. So people really beginning to join up the dots. And of course this is about nearly 4 years ago, there was also the rise of Extinction Rebellion. So people were hearing these messages about, this is really serious, we're facing extinction. And that applied also. So there's lots of people who maybe hadn't thought very much about climate change before, who were beginning to think about it. There were also loads of people who'd been working on climate all their lives, in the environmental movement, for example, or just, trying to do stuff about living more lightly on the planet. And those people too, often, there was a real surprise at suddenly feeling how painful it was. They've been working in this area all their lives. They've been feeling passionate and feeling energetic and feeling worried, but not feeling swamped with emotions, with fear or with anxiety or with rage. And I think that was starting to happen. And so both of those groups of people, I think, benefit from climate cafes up to a point. There are loads and loads of other different things we can do, but this is the thing that I do. And the idea is that it's a space where we can normalise talking about climate feelings. We can say, this is a collective problem. This is not somebody's individual mental health issues, so this is not the koala. Perhaps also, through talking, we can start to imagine what it might be like to work together on this stuff, rather than feeling, I'm the one who's got to cut down on eating meat, or I'm the one who's got to make sure that I turn the temperature down by 1 degree. And all of those things are important in our homes, but they're not the scale of work that's needed, and also they're very lonely and very isolating and individualist. And so the idea was to create a space where we could feel that we were a collective. And also, and we'll maybe come on to a bit more of this, the idea that for many people, it's like, I do not wish to be associated with the environmental movement. I do not wish to be seen as something to do with Extinction Rebellion or my local green group, because that's not who I am. So that those feelings may have been a real part of the awakening in 2018, 2019 for many people. It's like, but I've been leading this kind of life that assumes this isn't a problem. And I don't know that I really want to suddenly become an environmentalist. That's not me. And so a climate cafe is meant to be a really open space where, you aren't going to have to do meditation. You might have to do a weird thing with a rock, but it won't last very long, and it will be an experience that's kind of familiar. You're sitting around a table in a cafe, having a cup of coffee and a slice of cake, and you're talking about climate feelings. So you're kind of making it okay for people in that kind of, it's part of their existing identity in a way.
And how does that connect with group process then?
Yeah, sorry, I missed it. Thanks for reminding me. So part of what we do in a climate cafe is to notice. So as facilitators, we would try to notice what's happening in the group, and we would say it seems that we're very grieving today, or we're very full of anger today. People might be really going on about how much they hate the government, and that loads. Those kinds of things might become noticeable, and so we would comment on the group process in that way, and that helps people to feel more. Again, this is not just me. that my feelings are part of what's going on in the group.
But you're not re-traumatizing yourselves, each other.
Yeah.
I mean, how
Yeah.
do you avoid, you know, because I've been working with trauma as well, and how are you avoiding that you're not re-traumatizing yourself?
That's difficult, and it doesn't. It's not always possible, I think. So you might have a group of people who come together, and a couple of them are really in the kind of extinction zone, and they're really kind of despairing. And for some people joining a cafe, there may be they've not really thought of that before, and so that's a real shock. And what we say is all the feelings that are brought are only feelings. We're not trying to persuade anybody of anything, and we're not trying to change anybody's mind or persuade people to do something. And so it's only a feeling. Okay. We can name a feeling. It doesn't mean we have to act on it.
Okay.
And that means that there is, and also because it's a lot of people, or say 10 people, you've got nobody's taking up all the space, and so nobody can kind of insist on this is. I'm going to tell you all about my trauma or my really terrible feelings, because we know that we need to share. We have a process of taking it in turns, and so it's. I mean, it is really gentle. And it's not meant to be going very deep. We say at the beginning, this is not a therapy group, but you bring the feelings you want to bring. And it's a question, it's just putting them into words and then moving on.
That's
and we
interesting.
reckon that is, it's not perfect, but it's a good way to start, perhaps, for some people.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to it, I guess, in my own practice of working with groups of people. So I started this series of works called Healing the Museum in 2012, because I felt that museums were kind of dying because, they were very disconnected with what was going on outside, politically and also spiritually. So I started to bring different energies and different types of people into art spaces through using shamanism and meditation. And one of these performances was called A Meal for My Ancestors. And this was done in Belgium, actually in Brussels, and I did a 4-month residency there. And it was just after the bombing. Remember, there was the bombing in the airport there. And so the city was quite tense, and it was just at the beginning of the Syrian refugee crisis. So remember how that was. And then I worked with 2 sets of groups of people. So one set of people were like refugees and migrants and activists. And I'd go to where the refugees were, I'd meet the doctors and the psychologists, and then I invited them to come to free meditation classes for 4 months. And that was because, when people are very traumatized physically, it's much more about quietening the mind, let's say. Whereas I then also went to the Parliament and I did a little talk, and then I got people from the EU Parliament and from NATO and from the UN and other people who work in different agencies to also take part in the project. And for them, I did a creative visualization workshops for 4 months for free as well. And then at the end of that, I brought the 2 groups of people together. And what was really interesting, because my idea was about how the power dynamics would be, because when you've got all these people lying on the floor, you've got someone that works in the terrorist department next to a refugee, next to, a high court judge, next to, it really changes things, because in the end, you're just a body lying on the floor. And so this kind of idea of, you said it was quite gentle, but this kind of gentle interrogation of oneself within a group, and within the group, let's say the group mind, it's a really powerful experience. And so the idea of this actual performance was to kind of think about how we can heal trauma. And what was interesting is that most people saw things on their shamanic journey that was about climate change. Okay, and so that was really fascinating, because I don't prescribe what they're going to see. I'm in the trance and they're going into trance, and you see what you see. But most people saw things to do with climate change. Right. And then in the project, there was a woman who worked in the Foreign Office, and she kind of she saw something really difficult to do with climate refugees. And then she decided to do something really, which I really thought was amazing and really very practical, because of what she'd seen during this, like, you know, spiritual performative moment. She decided to write this paper about changing the law for climate refugees. Because at the moment, you know, if you're a refugee and you come to Europe for war or genocide, then you can, you know, ask for asylum. But if you come for climate, you can't. Yeah. So she started this think tank in the parliament and wrote this paper on the, and you can read it. It's like, it's very formal, it's got graphs and things, but it comes out of what her vision was that she saw on this shamanic journey. And for me, that was like really important to see how like something so abstract and, you know, non-rational, these non-rational methodologies can inform the practical. Yeah. And yeah, that's, in terms of group process, I feel like those elements of, you know, you could say the sacred, but also the practical or the profound and the profane, it's important to come together, you know. It's not one or the other.
Indeed, and we'll talk in a minute about this space as perhaps as a representation of those things coming together. But I am really interested in this question about how to put it. If you're getting people to go quite deep, and you know, in climate cafes we are trying not to re-traumatize people, but there needs to be some kind of opportunity to share feelings, because otherwise, kind of, what are you there for, really? Because you've got to normalize it. So how do you, in your shamanic work and in your projects which bring people together from all over the place, how do you manage that non-re-traumatizing work? What are you doing, do you think, that is learning?
You have to prepare people before they come. So, for example, you know, there are certain protocols. Like here, we did this performance. You know, part of the idea of the temple is that we do performances and events in it. And I did this performance called Labour, Birth of a New Museum. So we asked 10 pregnant women in the second and third trimester to come and to go on a shamanic journey. And it was about finding the soul names of their babies, their unborn children. And my idea was like, by connecting with the unborn who are coming to this planet, you know, and they're going to get a shock when they come out and they realise how messed up it is, then it's good to warn them, isn't it? You know, and to also understand how the art space is a place for, learning on all levels, you know, and that's the idea of the temple. But, to answer your question, so for that, you know, there was a lot of preparation done in terms of like telling people, well, they're pregnant, so they shouldn't be smoking or drinking or taking drugs. But that's really key, and making sure that people are psychologically ready to go on a journey, because it's a real thing. You know, real emotions come up and real, you know, it can be very cathartic, and it can also be very beautiful and very healing, in a gentle way. But generally, people feel transformed afterwards. And with the pregnant women, what's amazing, you know, is because they were in that moment of just getting to know their children, you know, before they come through, and by finding their soul names, that they start this relationship to them, you know, in the journey. But for me, what was key was talking to the children as a whole, so talking to all the 10 unborn, you know, children, kind of like telling them about what the planet's like, what to expect, that their mothers are going to look after you know, it's like, it's like a preparation. But the key to the preparation is this idea of when you come in a space, so whenever you go in a spiritual, like even at a church or a sweat lodge, you cross a threshold. And it's the crossing of the threshold that begins the transformative part, you know, and that is part of, like, when I was thinking about this idea of a spiritual overlay for the building. So what Canon was talking about, that the idea that you go through the different galleries and you change, you transform, and, you know, even in the titles of the galleries, I was thinking about what kind of journey the viewer would need to go through in order to kind of somehow be affected. And, like, for example, in the space next door, in Celine's space, you know, there's a lot of AV, there's a lot of film, but in here it's like, usually there's nothing, it's dead silent, it's quiet, and so how these differences, just visual differences, and sensory differences can change you. I think in that way, it's the same as holding space. And I think, you know, when you work with healing and shamanism, the key is to hold the space, you know, so to make people feel that they can let go. And, you know, I only ask people to do things that I've done hundreds of times. I don't ask people to do things I've never done, because it would be unethical, you know. But, yeah, and I'm really proud of everybody that has participated in these things. And, you know, people write to me after and they say, oh, I experienced this, I saw that, you know, and it seems to, work.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it sounds to me like, if you took a climate cafe, that would be a very first step towards, I mean, for many people, it might be a really significant step towards a threshold of the kind I was talking about earlier, where people might feel, okay, I'm now somebody who worries about climate and wants to do something about it. So at a very kind of fairly straightforward level, it's still a big threshold, but it's a very, in terms of a kind of continuum of what feels ordinary, inside, close to me, part of ordinary day-to-day life, it's fairly at that end. Whereas for many people, I think your work may feel quite a big step.
Yes.
And so I'm sort of interested in where that line is for people, for different people. You know, what feels like a real step into the unknown, or perhaps a step into something that feels like a bit weird or a bit strange or a bit difficult. And I'm interested in where that line was for you when you started doing this kind of work, and how you work with it.
Well, I think I'm a person that's enjoyed being in difficult spaces because, you know, since I was a kid, I've been in many different cultures, but I've also put myself on many, like, long retreats or very difficult, you know, silent, you know, when you can't speak, you can't read, you can't write, or you're sitting in a cell for hours in sensory deprivation. And I kind of enjoy that, you know, because, you know, you're learning something about oneself, the bigger self, than you do in, you know, I mean, it's the balance of going to Tesco's, isn't it? And, you know, being in the monk cell, you know. But for me, I guess one of the biggest tests was when I, in 2012, decided to give up living in London and go and live in the nature and in these rural communities. And, you know, before that, I'd gone to Burning Man Festival by myself. I'd been in New Zealand woofing. I'd dipped in and out, but I hadn't, like, committed it. Yeah. But then in 2012, I just threw most things away, and I was like, okay, I'm doing it. I'm going off. And so that was, like, fascinating to be, you know, because sometimes I'd be, like, in very strict disciplinary places, like a monastery where you literally live by the gong. 4:30 a.m. you're up. You're meditating, 6 o'clock's breakfast, 7:30, you're cleaning something, 8 o'clock you meditate, you know, like it's really structured. Yeah. And then sometimes I'd go and live in completely opposite places. I went to live with the Hare Krishnas to see what they were like, and they drove me nuts because they had no discipline. Are you laughing? They've got no discipline, and they don't even have locks on their doors. You know, there's no privacy. You know, it's like the complete opposite. And that to me, was way too much, you know. But it was really interesting to go as an experiment. Like, I really thought there's got to be a better way than living in the small flat in London. You know, what's it going to be like? And there were good things that I learned about, you know, being in groups, but there's also, what was fascinating is to see how the same problems in the city are reflected in those communities, like racism, sexism, classism, you know, because they're mostly white middle class people living in those communities, and how, you know, this, especially communities that started in the 60s, you know, how they've peaked, you know, because they had, like, they galvanized their ecological communities and permaculture communities, you know, they set themselves up, but now they're like super expensive, luxurious, you know, like Findhorn. It started in a caravan, and now it's like these amazing designer buildings. And so, yeah, that was really interesting to see, but also this constant negotiation of, yeah, let's say a threshold of whether to go to the city or not, because I came up with this rule of I'd only go to the city when it was necessary. Like, I wouldn't, yeah, so if I had an appointment or I really had to go there, otherwise I didn't want to go there. And so sometimes I'd ask curators to come, you know, to the countryside, and it was a real hassle. Some of them didn't want to get on the country bus, or, you know, like, sometimes it was a real drama. But, like, yeah, I was really like, and also my ideas about economy changed, and these ideas about gift culture, and a lot about sacred economics, you know, and that filtered down into my artwork, because then I started doing more social practice. So, yeah, things like the ARC, the project where I kind of started my own community and invited scientists and artists to live off-grid, and the outskirts of Paris, and COVERSLUT as well, which is about fashion and economics. But this is all informed from living in these communities.
Yeah.
You know?
And it's sounding to me like there's a kind of coming together with the discipline, and then a drifting away from the discipline, and, you know, power structures and class structures come in somehow, and it becomes, as you say, becomes privileged, and then maybe something comes round again, and you recreate it as a community. I'm reminded here, and I hadn't thought about this before we were speaking just now, but thinking about my dad, who's a follower of Gurdjieff, and who's been part of a Gurdjieff farm for about 50 years now.
Okay.
And watching him with that experience, and the way they all kind of come in and out of it, and people leave and come back, and how they hold the question of staying with the truth but not being fixated by it, I think, is really difficult. And he goes through phases of not being involved because it's too hard. And then he goes back in. And maybe it sounds a little bit like your patterns of trying it out and experiencing it in different places. And
yes, of going in and out, but also sometimes really committing to it, and also being jealous of people who just, you know, like, because my issue was always like, okay, that means I have to give up art. If I really, you know, like, there was a point when I was in a forest community in Argentina, and there's no electricity there, so to do an email I have to walk to the town. So there was this point of where I'm going to have to choose between one or the other, because you can't reconcile them at that moment. And so, yeah, it's been an evolution of, like, trying to decide, you know, how to put those two things together, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are we doing?
Yes, I think we're doing okay.
There's something I wanted to say about defences, just briefly, because I think this is a big part of climate psychology work, that we need defences because we've got to cope, and they are, you know, defences against the really painful feelings, and just wanting to say that I think when we're faced with a sort of line of, can I go over that line? Could I really see myself in that other space? That perhaps what we might need to notice is what are the defences that are coming up that stop us doing that? or that are getting in the way. And it might be to do with identity, or it might be, you know, it might be feeling really anxious that something is just going to come out and we won't be able to control it. And I think that's you can imagine that with the idea of sharing feelings in a climate cafe, but it's also about the kind of bigger questions about who I want to be in the world.
But is that about, you know, because we've been talking a bit about food, you know, like, and how, in terms of the relationship of food to the climate, you know, like not just food miles and kind of, thinking, oh, I bought this avocado and now I feel really guilty because I know the avocado came from there. So, and then having a grieving period before you eat the avocado, or just blatantly going, fuck the avocado, I'm just going to eat the avocado kind of thing. Like, or, you know, because, but then this idea of like, because food is an everyday thing that 99% of the population eat food every day. So how you deal with that, you know, and is it, you know, as a defense mechanism, or is it like, you know, with eating disorders, it's about control, you know, like you're controlling your environment, you're controlling your body, you know.
Yeah, and I think food and those kind of dilemmas about am I going to eat this avocado are really... So food and climate is, of course, as you say, it's the kind of, there's a kind of factual thing about what do we need to eat and how do we manage that. And then there's the very individualist, you know, I am going to make these choices and this is going to help me control things. And I think for somebody who's really struggling with climate feelings, often a way of managing those is to say, you know, I'm going to eat these things but not these things. And it has echoes of struggles with eating, you know, difficulties with food generally. And so I have a bit of a dilemma about climate cafes because, you know, the idea is this is a space where we might have a nice slice of cake together. Well, for some people that's not okay. And for other people as well, there may be a question of what kind of cake. You know, is that going to be a vegan cake?
Yeah.
And this was quite an issue when we first started doing them. And I may have got a bit more relaxed about it, and it's the cake is the cake, you know, eat it or not.
Yes.
But because I think the point of this is the hospitality and the sharing and the coming together over food, which as you know is really important. That for me kind of takes precedence over those questions of control. But I suppose the other thing about those issues of control is we're allowing our shame to stop us doing things. You know, we feel really ashamed about what we're eating and whether we're keeping our, you know, whether we're eating meat and all of those things. And it takes our attention away from the bigger scale of what's needed, it seems to me. And of course we need to take individual action. We can't just kind of say it doesn't matter what I do, because it does matter, because that's a defense too. But to be able to say, okay, I'm not going to let these feelings stop me being who I need to be and doing what is needed for climate.
I mean, I've had different phases, like when I was younger and I had a guru, and you know, we did a lot of fasting, a lot of 10-day rice diet, you know, and I was very strict. I even used to make my own toothpaste out of clay and, you know, sea salt and stuff. And then I normalised again, because that was also the thing about living in nature a lot of the time. Then I started to think, what about the people in the city? There needs to be a dialogue with the people in the city. You know, you can't just escape and, you know, run off. I think those days have gone, like we just escape, you know, there has to be this relationship thing. And in terms of food, I think, you know, part of the project, A Meal for My Ancestor, was this idea of commensality, because the idea of the meal was that it was a physical meal and also a spiritual meal. And so, like, in terms of the physical meal, I invited the general public, because I organised this conference where I invited a doctor, from Texas to come and talk about commensality and the health benefits of eating together. And also I invited a shaman to come and show scans, brain scans, because she was working with the Sabon to show how, you know, what happens when you're in trance, so the effect on your physical body. And so that was kind of part of the conference. And then I invited the general public to bring food. And it was really funny because with the patrons of the place I was doing the residency, they didn't believe people would bring food. They were like, no, we have to organise, we have to have a chef, we have to have this, you know. And I was like, no, people will bring food, people will bring food. And like 90 people came and they brought so much food. And we had too much food in the end, and from all cultures and things. And it was like really fascinating, you know. And so that was like kind of the physical meal. But then the spiritual meal, like I said, I was working for 4 months giving free creative visualizations lessons to like the people who worked in these staff agencies. So people that work in the UN and NATO and stuff, they have their physical safety is really high. You know, they feel, you know, they have enough money to live, they have a nice life, but their mental anxiety and confusion is crazy, because the ones that I was working with are generally, you could say, good people, but they're stuck in these kind of bureaucratic jobs, which means that they have no creative abilities, you know, in terms of like bending rules, getting around things, you know, more humanness, let's say. And so I started doing this, it's a Tibetan Buddhist technique called feeding your demons. And so we would get the people who are like, let's say in those agencies. So for example, there was a guy, he was a high court judge in Lille, and he does all the terrible asylum cases. So people who are refugees who are trying to get to England, but they get stuck in Lille or Calais, he has to deal with. Like, so he's changing people's lives every day, isn't he? And he's not doing it just like nonchalantly. He's like thinking about everybody, like he's trying to do it properly, you know. But imagine the pressure of trying to do that job properly and knowing that you're ruining, you know.
Yeah.
And so, so he was part of this, these classes that I would give on feeding your demons, and the idea of that is trying to find the part of you that is kind of dissociated or feels guilty or trauma or shame, you know, and that can come out through over smoking or overusing your computer or your social media, you know, it can, and then using that part of you and kind of taking it out of your body and kind of personifying it, and then you like basically have a conversation with it, and then you absorb it back. So then you re-eat it, let's say. And so this idea of having a spiritual meal and a real meal was really important to the project, because when you talk about healing trauma, for me, there were like, you know, you can use meditation, you can use shamanism, but food is key, you know, within this art context, you know, which I work in. But what was really funny as well in the conference, I invited some people that work at the Parliament to come as well, and we had like a panel discussion, so with the doctor, the shaman, me and a guy from the Parliament, and to debate whether shamanism could become like a new healing modality. You know, like mindfulness and meditation is quite normal nowadays. You know, if you go to your doctor, he might prescribe for you that you should go and do meditation, you know. And so like how shamanism also has big health benefits. And so we kind of had this debate whether in Europe, you know, it could be part of the health system, you know. I mean, it isn't so far.
No. but maybe there'll be a paper written in the way that there was about the refugees.
Exactly. Exactly. Maybe it's nice to open to the public.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Has anybody got any questions?
What questions do you have?
If not, we'll just carry on talking.
We'd love some questions and thoughts.
Oh,
yeah.
there's Sam.
Thanks so much, first of all. Grace, so you took this decision 10 years ago to say goodbye to cities, right? And you came back to cities. You live in Brussels now. Why did you come back? What changed your mind?
Well, it isn't what changed my mind. It was more that when it was that choice of whether to stay, and let's say more spiritual places like monasteries or whatever, or having to give up being an artist, there was a point where I really wanted to do a project called COVERSLUT, the fashion project. COVERSLUT is about working with different local communities and making fashion and selling it as pay what you can and using that money to make ecological collections. That's the basic. And it's like democratic in the sense of we have an anti-sweatshop, so everybody gets paid something. And, we work issues with class and race and gender and this idea of who has the right to be fashionable. And so in order to do that project, I had to kind of stay still, because before that, for 6 years, I was very nomadic. I just had 2 bags and I was moving around between communities and different countries and whatever. But then for that, I kind of had to embed myself in this community. And I found a local textile studio in Ghent that was kind of on the, Ghent's a very beautiful touristy place, but there's a Turkish neighborhood which is a bit poorer, and that's where the textile studio was. And I thought, I'm going to have to live here for a bit to get to know, otherwise COVERSLUT, it won't work, because otherwise you're just coming in, hovering and then, doing something top down and then leaving. So I ended up being there 18 months, and we did 5 collections, all different fashion collections and different events. And, one of those things was I would see most of the ladies were old Turkish ladies, and I'd see them at the bus stop and I'd see them in the park, and so I started to understand really test my theory out about what fashion can be. It can be obviously, haute couture and, high catwalks and everything, but it can also be this other thing. And so that's why I came back to the city. And then Brexit and the lockdown happened. And so I was okay, I happened to be there, and then I moved to Brussels. But you know what I mean? I happened to be there, so I just carried on, But before that, I had planned to go back to the countryside, into nature. But now I've kind of trying to set it up where at least 2 months, 1 to 2 months a year, I go to different communities, because I'm still in touch with a lot of people in different communities. Last summer I was in Romania, in Transylvania, in the forest there, in a spiritual festival. And, so I have lots of connections with people. This summer I'm hoping to go to Australia, because a friend of mine, he's Brooke Andrews, he's an amazing artist. He's an Aborigine, and so we're going to go and we're going to do a lot of work with Aborigine women, his family and his ancestors, and work with them in terms of healing techniques and stuff that you couldn't do, you just couldn't do without a local person, you just wouldn't have that access. And I think that's really key. For me, it's really still important to, especially with Indigenous communities, to be learning knowledge, exchanging knowledge. And maybe one day I will just go back and live in the countryside or nature.
But it sounds like it's to do with, partly you go where the work is, and partly it's not I am this or I am that, but at the moment I'm doing this and so I'm here. And that's a kind of something that will constantly be shifting. And I think it's fluid. Absolutely. And of course that's getting harder, isn't it?
Right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And whether we will continue to be able to move around in the way that you have. Yeah, we've got to. We may have to face up to that getting harder and harder. I don't mean because we've got to be good and not fly, but because increasingly national borders are going up,
Yeah, but the whole flying thing is really interesting, because about 5 years ago I made a calculation. I sat down and I literally wrote the calculation of my flights versus, because I don't drive and I don't have any children, so versus my carbon footprint, I worked it out, and I worked out that if I fly the amount that I think I will fly, and I try to reduce some food miles, it will equal the same as if I had 2 children and, you know, and drove a car. So yeah, I think everybody should sit down and try to work it out, like, because it's fascinating, you know, and not to feel guilty about it, but just to look at what you're doing as a human being. Like, you know, you sit down and do your taxes, you know, and you have to do practical things. This is just a part of life, like, just sit down and go, okay, I do that, maybe I can do less of that, maybe I can do more of that, but just do it in a very guilt-free, dissociate, you know what I mean?
Straightforward kind of way. And understanding the numbers. Because I think it's so easy for defences to come into that, isn't it? It's kind of not actually realising that there's a big difference between one thing and another thing in terms of you can't equate.
No, and also because
turning the temperature down a bit to
exactly
transatlantic flights or whatever. So it's how you work that out needs to be accurate and number based. And while, of course, at the same time, we're all dealing with the inherited guilt and shame and anxiety, and so that makes it more difficult. And just creating yourself a bit of space to do it, treating it like the taxes. That's a really interesting metaphor.
No, but like, because you have to do it, it's just a function of life.
And it's numbers. And
Exactly. Yeah. But also I think what's important is to understand what you can and cannot live without.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think, because of the way I grew up, like in an airport, going to Kenya, going to, you know, like, to me that's a second home, like it's a normal place, you know. So when, let's say without the pandemic, if I haven't been to the airport for like 3 months, 6 months, I start to feel weird. I do start to feel, whereas somebody else, they might feel that about their car. If they don't go on a car trip, or they don't, you know, drive for once a week, they start to feel, so you have to figure out what kind of person you are, really, and what you can live with and what you can't live with, live without.
And what you might need to grieve the loss of.
That
seems to me to be really important. So sometimes we kind of go through a process of saying, well, for a while, I'm not going to give that up, I can't give that up. But then we maybe kind of find ourselves thinking, actually, maybe I do need to give that up. And so that process involves a bit of grieving, I think.
Yeah, and changing as well, and understanding, okay, I need to adapt, you know. So, like, I think most people have, well, I know in the art world, most people have decided, okay, because now we can do so many things by Zoom, you know, you can do Zoom talks, you can have Zoom meetings, you don't have to, like, go to the place all the time. So it's like, I mean, the reason why we could have done this on Zoom, I guess, but the reason why I wanted to do this is also because of this idea of being in this architecture and having the shared energy.
So tell us about this space.
Well, yeah, so basically I've always been looking at traditional Indigenous architecture, like we were saying, sweat lodges, but also my grandmother, she used to live in an adobe hut, you know, where you like crawl through and like there's a fire in the middle. And so I have those kind of memories in me, and, you know, also visiting different types of architecture, like in permaculture places and things, and think about what that means to me. But also in this, we've kind of mixed it with this idea of a modernist display structure. So how, you know, art can be, we can live with art and sit with art and, you know, have it, but we can also still use the space as a communal space. Like in a lot of traditional Indigenous communities who have meeting halls, you know, you can have like I was telling you earlier, I've just been invited to this, I'm not going to go there, but to this Indigenous Film Festival in New Zealand. And it's taking place in one of their traditional meeting houses, and then they have the films, and like, yeah, that's really amazing that you can have a ceremonial space that is flexible, you know, and has meetings and groups of people, and how is that's embedded into the architecture. because I start to think about this idea of spiritual technologies and how the building is kind of, you know, at the beginning of the project, I start to think about how the building is a kind of mothership, you know, that we're in, and, you know, and how that feeds down. And it literally fed down to doing that performance with the pregnant women, like being in a mothership. But there's also, yeah, how this can be, this type of, how architecture is a type of spiritual technology.
Right. Yeah, and the ordinariness of some of the objects in here seemed to me to be really part of that. You know, the little figure over there that I just loved, on the clay figure, and the owl. There's something really kind
Chiara's.
of, there's something so kind of ordinary, and the ordinariness and the kind of almost kind of grandness of the shape.
Yes,
I just think it's really important, and for me that just connects with something that I think is important in my life. Is to be able to manage both the ordinary and the day-to-day on the one hand, and the spiritual.
Yes,
on the other.
this grandeur.
Yeah. And you've got more kind of depth of exploration of bringing those two things together. But for me, that's kind of an ordinary response to an extraordinary place.
Thank you. Is there another question? Okay.
Yes, the lady there. The mic's coming.
Sort of half question, half comment, because I wasn't quite sure what I was coming to tonight. I sort of knew, but I didn't know, if you know what I mean. And I think I've been slightly surprised by the focus on trauma, and I understand why that is, but I'm just trying to think it through. And you've also mentioned quite a lot about motherhood and a number of things associated with that in terms of symbolism. And then you also mentioned being in New Orleans. And it's quite interesting because I was reflecting back in that arc of time. I had my daughter, and she was born at the point of I had her, and then 9/11 happened, like a month after. When she was 18 months, we went to New Orleans. A year later, Katrina happened. We happened to go to Egypt on a lovely holiday, blah, blah, blah. And the next year was the Arab Spring. All I'm saying is, for her...
You're doing it. You're ruining
So I'm
the world.
thinking more from my daughter's point of view, and she's grown up in the last 20 years, and every person who's gone through, 20 years will always have those seismic things. As an adult, with a daughter, I could never I tried to find lots of ways that she never experienced life traumatically. And what I find is coming across to me in what you're saying is, and I don't know how you deal with this, is obviously you've got an audience coming in here who don't necessarily agree with the particular way that you're looking at things. It's a public funded place and all the rest of it. And I suppose the way that I see it a bit more is that what we experience is contradictions of a society that is both creative and destructive. And it's within our ability to solve problems. And I think that's the reason why I'm slightly reacting to experience everything in this sort of way of trauma, because I don't feel guilt. Because I think the fact that we've got, 7 billion people living in the world, the fact that many, many more people live in cities, the fact that people don't live in abject poverty, but we simultaneously have not solved the problems we need to solve. So I'm probably, it's not like I'm cup half full versus cup half empty, I just think they're human problems we have to solve. And I think art is a connection that you have with the world around you, but I don't feel disconnected from it. It's a problem we have to solve. And so I think it's my responsibility as an adult that my daughter doesn't feel traumatised, but you have conversations about what you can and can't do. And there's a lot of her friends who are traumatised by the pandemic and all these sorts of things. And I think we've got to take some responsibility here. So I'm having quite strong reactions to what you're saying. So I just needed to weave it together a little bit to say there's an arc here as adults that we need to have a slightly different relationship to this discussion and how we have these conversations. So, and Annie Elbers, love her. So it was lovely to come to the exhibition for that. So sorry if I went on a bit, but I'm just, it's not question, but it's a whole experience of the exhibition, which I spent quite a lot of time at and trying to think at how you're relating to it versus how I'm relating to the problem. So.
Yeah. Yes, but it doesn't sound like there's an issue, like from what you're saying, that you found a balanced way to be able to be in the world and to be a constructive person and to deal with things.
Yeah, I think I don't see a climate emergency. And that's
okay, that's what you mean, yes.
And so sorry, I'll draw that, I still didn't explain myself. So I think it's that thing about is there a risk of something happening and how likely is it? And I think a lot of the things aren't going to happen in the way that everything's lumped in and there's going to be this catastrophic disaster that's going to come like a meteorite. There are lots of individual things and a lot of them are very unlikely to happen. And that's how you then, for me, deal with the problems and how you then relate to the world around you. And the art encompasses your fears and feelings and experiences. But I think there's a very important thing that I think we're in danger of leaving people unable to deal with what are things that you can deal with.
No, okay. No, I mean, I would say, yeah, I think that's the joke of that film, Don't Look Up. There isn't going to be just one catastrophe, like one big catastrophe that's going to happen and, you know, wipe everyone out and mess everything up. It's more that there's little things, step by step, and then you go past the tipping point. And there are two tipping points. I remember I was talking about this. The tipping point of climate, tipping point, you know, which we haven't, for some people we haven't gone past, for some scientists we have gone past. And then, like, for example, with Indigenous cultures, they think that there's already been a relational tipping point, you know, that we went past with slavery and colonialism, and, you know, and that does affect how and why because if you see the earth, not you personally, but people see the earth as a dead object, just as a resource in which they can just excavate and take things, then you completely undermining your own humanity because you're killing your own home, if you know what I mean. And so if we carry on down that route, then there's no way of us kind of resolving anything. And so what I was trying to say earlier, yes, we can resolve things with technology, but we also need to resolve things in conversation with the groups of people who have been around for longer, you know, because a lot of Indigenous groups have been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years and have experienced extreme weather changes, you know, already. And so, and have experienced extinctions in terms of human extinctions like smallpox, you know, which was a kind of a pandemic, you know, it's the same kind of thing. So how and why not, you know, understand and learn from that?
Yeah. And I mean, I would just add that I think one of the difficulties about climate in particular, but all the interlocking things, the intersecting things like the pandemic where we hope we're coming out of now, and maybe the possibility of future pandemics, the war that is taking place in Europe and the wars that have been taking place in other parts of the world that we don't pay quite so much attention to in this country. And really crucially, the uncertainties about all of those things. And I think people have different ways of responding to uncertainty. And I completely respect what you're saying, that this is not one great big emergency. We don't know. We can't say this is definitely happening, and we're not also in a position to say humanity and the earth will be wiped out. It's the how we respond to the changes and the way, as Grace puts it, there's kind of step by step and interlocking things. So how we deal with that at a human level is, for me, like the big work of our time. And you've just put your finger on it. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for coming. And yes, thank you.
Thank you, Grace.
Oh, yeah, thank you.